Chapter 2, Sidetracked. Of all the Peters sisters, and there were 7 of them besides the 2 brothers, Alice Peters showed the most promise. Her mother was a fat, stern woman who took her Christianity very, very seriously, thank you, and she was thrilled when Alice packed off for Bible school in New Jersey. It was a long way from the Peters' home in Paris, Ontario, and Alice was a little intimidated being so far away and bearing the responsibility of performance. She kept mostly to herself on campus, and her grades were reasonably good. And as she studied more and more of the scriptures, she felt within her a restless calling to the evangelistic field. Her friends delightedly nicknamed her Amy as she took to the preaching circuit. The preaching ministry of Amy Semple McPherson was at its zenith of popularity, and they swore that Alice would follow in her anointed footsteps. Churches found that Alice was a good preacher. Her meetings were successful, and they grew generally larger from season to season as she crisscrossed the North American continent with her simple gospel message. There were drawbacks, however, to being Mother's favorite. When Mrs. Peters took sick, she wanted no one else to care for her. Her enthusiasm for Alice's ministry stopped when her own well-being came into question. The other sisters were less inclined to lend a hand to the cross old woman anyway, so Alice reluctantly left her ministry. Only for a little while, she decided to stay at home with her ailing mother. At least this is the story we heard later. There was little money to spend. The Peters family had never been wealthy. Alice searched out a job in Paris and settled into the nurse's routine. Her mother was crabby or pitiful, depending on her mood, and it grated on Alice. It was hard to maintain a proper, positive, Christ-like outlook on life with this burden whining at her all the time. Mother's old car was making a funny sound one day, and Alice took it into a repair shop. The motor mechanic looked both at the car and at Alice. She in turn found him attractive, in a coarse way, smeared with axle grease and motor oil and dirt, shiny with perspiration. His name was Bob Wick, a fun-loving socializer, the worldly-wise gentleman in every sense. He was accustomed to a little drinking with friends at the hotel bar at the end of the day. Reluctantly at first, Alice joined him. But she grew accustomed to Bob's lifestyle as well. Somehow in the weeks that followed, her spiritual perspective slipped out of focus. Almost helplessly, she wandered into a new, sad life. Tongues wagged all through the town. The townspeople loved good gossip, and this relationship, after Alice's work in the ministry, provided the best of fodder. Here was the beautiful sidetracked lady evangelist, in love with the handsome, rough-hewn mechanic. There was evidence of goodness in the relationship elements that Alice could hook into emotionally, and used to rationalize away her shattered morality. Bob was courteous to her, a gentleman. He was faithful to her, making her his only object of affection. They doted on each other. It felt like Alice always imagined true romance would feel. Her mother was angry, crushed, embarrassed. She was noisily horrified when Alice moved out, and yet the union took more and more definite shape. When Rose was born, Alice struggled to keep up. Hers had never been a very order-conscious family. Now her housekeeping, or lack of it, confirmed the heritage. The little house, not at all chic to begin with, was strewn with clutter and smudged with smeary kinds of dirt that comes from failing to clean surfaces carefully. Laundry and kitchenware were continually backlogged, giving the house an atmosphere of chaotic struggle. Otherwise, Bob and Alice settled in and installed themselves in the Paris community as more or less normal family. They had a usual amount of contact with her mother, and Bob's mother, and some as well with Bob's older brother Cyrus, a local plasterer. In many ways, theirs was typical of the lower middle-class life in the small cities of Ontario in the 1930s. The infant Rose was followed by Jay, and later by a third child, Frank. But life day-to-day became more complex for Alice with each new child. Funds were scarce as the Depression drained the continent. Patience wore thin. Life was troublesome and annoying. Still, Bob and Alice were making it. Then a northern winter wind brought pneumonia to Paris, and Bob took sick. The illness seized him slowly, forcing him to bed again and again, and eventually leaving him there permanently. His lungs filled ominously with poison, choking off his air supply. His groupy cough echoed through the house, punctuating the crying of babies and the staticky noise of a cheap radio, until one day. There was very little money left to bury him properly. Bob's mother was hateful toward Alice and refused to offer any assistance. But Bob's older brother Cyrus, who was fond of Alice, gave her some help. He felt badly for her, left stranded and practically penniless with 3 children in the middle of a depression. He'd always looked on Alice kindly, if for nothing else than for what had obviously been great beauty not so long ago. Now, of course, her hair had thinned out considerably, and the crow's feet were creeping out from her eyes. But she was still a lovely woman in her early 30s, and attractive, especially to a man like Cyrus, who had known marriage at one time, but whose wife had died tragically in a hellish neighborhood fire 5 years before. Cyrus had never had children, but he had wanted them. Now at 50, he felt that the opportunity for fatherhood might have passed him by. Cyrus sat and mused about Alice in the days after his brother's death. He could feel his interest stirring as he thought about her, thought about accompanying her to town, dining out with her, engaging in light and lively conversation with her, laughing with her, living with her, waking up beside her. In the earliest days of Alice's widowhood, Cyrus gladly provided the necessary tower of strength in her life. He tried to be as present as possible, filling in the emotional gaps as they became evident. She needed someone to talk to, someone more than at other times. She needed someone to listen to, where there had been someone for so long. She needed direction and comfort and support. And Cyrus provided all of that for her, willingly in the days and weeks after the funeral. At each turn, as he sensed her relying on him, he warmed up more to the idea of making her his own. And likewise, he felt more and more confident that she would indeed accept the notion. Look at her. She's smothered in children and housekeeping and financial need. A successful businessman in the community could solve most of her problems in a single stroke of the judge's pen. And he, Cyrus, he could feel the old youthful urges blossoming up again inside him. In lovely Alice Peters' wick, he could renew himself as a man and father his own brother's children and live the orderly, acceptable life as a 50-year-old Canadian businessman. But even as Cyrus Wick sat musing alone between frequent encounters with the object of his growing affection, the object of his growing affection was sitting alone and musing herself. Internally, she had fled from the guilt impulse for years, having trashed her spiritual heritage, burying her conscience deep in the daily routine of life. She had consciously dismissed the notion again and again that she had let her life be infected by sin. And yet the infection had spread so thoroughly now that it was hard to separate it from the stuff her life was made of. She surveyed the evidence. 3 children, a destitute financial condition, sadly symbolized by the stack of Bob's medical bills, a hostile mother-in-law, a hurt and broken mother to whom Alice was an ever-present embarrassment, and a loveless life without God. And as she looked around her, the house, she realized, was miserable, the final discouragement. She had felt occasional longings for the old righteous life, but it was never practical to consider it after Bob came along, and even less so after the children came along. Now, for the fleeting moment, she wondered if she could return, go back to the life she'd known, freedom she'd experienced but never fully appreciated, until it was gone. Now she had accepted a whole new burden, the burden of guilt and shame and of facing constant forms of disapproval. Alice sighed and glanced at her children. They were the source of multiple pressures in her life. Besides mothering them, she was now being harassed by provincial authorities to provide for them more adequately or risk court action. And besides the dark cloud of personal guilt, no matter how she tried to mask it, would always be hers to live under. And so ultimately, what was the point of trying to go back? She could never really make it right, she told herself. It was already too wrong. She could tell Cyrus Wick was going to make her an offer. She wanted to resist, to fall back and regroup and take God by the hand once again and live an upright life. She wrestled inside with the conflict. But Cyrus was so much security and good cheer. He was so much practical good sense. It was hard not to put her arms around him in tender moments when he was being so kind and patient with her. The conflict within her was not resolved by the time Cyrus finally asked her to marry him. It was tempting to accept for all the obvious reasons, even though he was 20 years her senior. But she wanted to flee at the same time, to run from the pressure, to escape the nagging provincial authorities, people, to set up shop with her children somewhere else. Some place where the past could be left far behind. Some place where the townspeople's tongues would not wag, where nobody would know the godly life she had once lived and would therefore have nothing to compare the present to. Where she could tell a single, elaborate lie about her past and be done with it all. People said there were a few more jobs available in the States than in Canada, Michigan was only a few hours away. She had 2 sisters in Flint. She could leave the children with her mother and spend a few weeks looking for work there. She could stake a new claim on life and bring the children after her and begin again, fresh and new, and for all practical purposes, clean. Cyrus did not anticipate rejection. He had spent hours and days imagining Alice's tender, timid response. Maybe she would even hesitate and want some time to think about it, in a thoroughly charming and feminine way. But he never foresaw the rejection. He was unprepared for what she said. It stung when he heard it. He roared silently inside, like a wounded lion, equally angry and hurt. It was unconscionable that she would ever turn him down. He was especially peeved by the realization that his brother had been good enough for her, and now he was not. A notion Cyrus created himself, although Alice never alluded to such a thought. And yet Cyrus' exterior was gentlemanly. He nodded and said he understood, and lied that it was all right. As she drove out of town with trunks he had helped her to pack, he was smoldering inside, the snubbed lover. The smoldering and boiling did not stop as she drove out of sight. Cyrus continued to feed it by reciting the grating scenes in his mind, the vulnerable times, the tender times when he had helped her and encouraged her, and then the ripping moment when she so casually explained that no, she couldn't marry him. Every time he rehearsed the scenes, he grew more and more furious with her. He had a great capacity for kindness. He had demonstrated that, and he had been cast off. But he also had a great capacity for revenge. This he and Alice would discover. Alice fled to Flint, Michigan, hoping vaguely for her life to turn around, hoping specifically to put some distance between herself and her past. Maybe, just maybe, she thought, she could finally get straightened out. Maybe a spiritual renewal would magically happen to her in a new environment, and she would suddenly begin living the kind of Christian life she knew was right. But her spiritual roots had long ago been pulled up. She was far removed from the foundation of Scripture that had once been the building block of her evangelistic ministry. Now there was no bedrock in her life, only running, fleeing, searching. In Flint, one company making machine parts had survived the collapse of all other machine parts companies. Irving Machine Parts was hiring temporary and part-time help, a far cry from most of the surviving businesses of the day, where no help wanted signs hung like tombstones outside front doors. Alice was hired there. The men on the job rarely found a good-looking woman working in the factory. She was the rare exception, and they gave her the appropriate amount of attention, which she thrived on day by day, smiling prettily or coyly or shyly, depending on the whim of the moment. There was one man in particular who caught Alice's eye. He worked near her in the factory. It only took him a couple of days to make a strong point of speaking to her. He was good-looking, with a strong square jaw and prominent cheekbones, a healthy, ruddy-faced man with a keen sense of humor. His name was Maury Blair. She liked him. They went to dinner a few times. Alice never mentioned her children back in Paris. She never mentioned Cyrus, left behind to stew. She did say she had been married and that her husband died of pneumonia. But this Maury Blair was so pleasant, so free from Alice's complicated life back in Canada, that she did not want to take any chances of spoiling a relationship with him. The relationship indeed did not spoil. As spring turned to summer in Flint, they grew fonder of each other and spent increasing stretches of time in more and more intimate settings. In no time at all, the vague quest for a new upright life had been forsaken, and Alice fell thoroughly in love with the charming, fun-loving Maury Blair. He had none of the roughness of Bob Wick, none of the aging seniority of Cyrus, and there was none of the paranoia of Paris. It was a delight to be with him, to talk and listen and laugh. They picnicked in the local forest preserve, and Alice floated in limbo, far from the pressures and cares and worries that had driven her to Flint in the first place. But life could only be pleasant in narrow interludes, as long as she continued running. As the days grew hotter, she came to the creeping realization that she was pregnant. The anguish began to deepen within her, as she began to understand what this would mean to Maury Blair. She could ruin him. She could devastate him if she presented him with this situation. And she loved him so much. She didn't want to see his suffering face when she broke the horrible news to him. She could see his laughing face turn sober, his bright, cheery eyes grow dim and sad. And then, in his upright, gentlemanly way, he would ask her to marry him, which would bring up the question of the 3 children back in Paris and the whole tangled story of her past. Each day she stewed a little hotter, as the need to make a decision pressed down tighter and tighter upon her. She juggled the options in her mind, desperate for one of them to jump out as the obvious best choice. And meanwhile she prayed, and prayed fervently that she would turn up miraculously, not to be pregnant. Maureen noticed her growing restless, seeming troubled, and sometimes distant. She could not keep her mind on a conversation. She was cross at times, but she kept insisting nothing was wrong. Inside she was bewildered. Life had turned on her once again. The pressure was on once more. She felt that the soon events would overwhelm her, and she would be thoroughly submerged in the tidal wave of bad luck and the horror of a tragic fate. The rock of her salvation seemed so long gone. She could never turn back there. She could never lean on Jesus again. It was so remote a possibility that she never paused to consider it seriously. That was her youth. That was her childhood. It was Sunday school. Now she must cope as an adult. And yet she could not seem to cope, not quite. She sat on the bed and sadness washed over her. Her tired face grew red and hot as she wept. It was senseless to cry to herself, but the grief of her life had caught up with her again. And now she had nowhere else to put it, except into her tears. She did not wail or moan. She only wept quietly, alone, hurting for herself, for her lover, for her children in Paris, and the child within her. And then, as she always did, she drew herself up with a deep breath, wiped her wet face with the back of her wrist, and set about to throw all the clothes back into her trunk. She must run again. She must flee the scene of the thoughtless, accidental crime. Perhaps with one more flight, she could erase the mistakes that were dogging her trail. She left no note for Maury Blair. She tried, but she could find no words. She could not bring herself to lie to him so consciously, so directly. Every lie was a new flight, but now she even fled from lying. At least, this is the story we heard later. When she failed to show up for work the next morning, Maury sensed immediately what had happened. At the end of the day, he went to her place and found it vacant. The ugly light began to dawn. He searched the room for a clue about her destination. There was nothing. Alice said nothing about her plans. No one at Irving Machine Parts had heard a word. The dull ache of panic threatened Maury's internal equilibrium. If she were carrying his child, he would want to know so. He wanted to marry her, to care for her, to provide for the child. But he could not know for sure, not until decades later, that he was indeed my father.